Hey guys, in this video we're focusing on GCSE English Lit Power and Conflict Poetry, specifically on the poem War Photographer. And War Photographer was written by Carol Ann Duffy. It was written in 1985 and it was inspired by her friendship with the famous photographers such as Don McCullen, who are war photographers. It was based on a photographer in a dark room developing photos from a recent trip to a war zone while his hands trembled in the safety of rural England. The main message from this poem is that people in peaceful countries are indifferent to the suffering of others, and war is a cycle of pain that the public views but quickly forgets. The spills of suffering and blood stained into foreign dust quotes from the poem symbolise the permanence of war's horror compared to the fleeting attention of the Sunday supplement readers. So the key ideas in the poem are the individual versus society, as the photographer carries a heavy burden of war's reality, while the rest of society remains comfortably indifferent and impassive. Another idea is the power of memory, as the half-formed ghost and blood stained into foreign dust show that war leaves permanent psychological and physical marks that cannot be easily erased. The inadequacy of language and art is also an idea, because although he captures 100 agonies, the photographer feels that his work is reduced to mere entertainment for Sunday supplement readers, their newspaper readers. Then another idea is a cycle of conflict, as the poem structure is cyclical. He leaves war, processes it, and then stares impassively as he flies back into it, suggesting war is an endless human habit. The structure of the poem. So it is 4 stanzas of equal length, known as sestets. The rigid control structure reflects the photographer's attempt to bring order to the chaos of war by framing it into a photo. It has a tight rhyme scheme, A, A, B, B, C, C, and the repetitive nursery rhyme-like rhythm creates a sense of the mechanical process of developing photos, while contrasting the horrific content with an ordered form. The enjambment and caesura in the poems has a use of full stops mid-line, for example, Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh. This mimics the clicking of a camera shutter, while enjambment reflects the spilling out of memories that he cannot contain. There's also a cyclical narrative, as the poem begins with him returning from a trip and ends with him on a plane going to another, suggesting that war and human indifference are a never-ending cycle. So, the context of the poem. It is about friendship with photographers, because the poet was about Carol Ann Duffy, who was friends with the famous war photographer like Don McCullen and Nick Ut, and she was fascinated by their unique perspective, being present at horrors but forced to remain a detached observer. It's also linked to the Vietnam War influence, as The Running Children in a Nightmare Heat is a direct reference to the iconic 1972 Napalm Girl photograph, which helped shift public opinion against the Vietnam War. Another idea is religious imagery, as Duffy uses Catholic imagery, for example, half sage, a priest preparing to intone a mass, to suggest that developing these photos is a solemn, sacred duty, treating the dark room like a sanctuary for the dead. It's also a critique of 1980s Britain, as the poem was written during a time of increasing media consumption. Duffy critiques the Sunday supplement culture, where horrific global events were consumed as entertainment alongside a morning coffee. Let's have a look at the actual poem. So here is the poem on this slide. You can pause this video and read it and press play when you're ready to continue. Let's have a look at doing a line-by-line analysis. So, in his dark room, he is finally alone. Finally alone suggests a sense of relief, but also isolation, as he needs the silence to process the trauma that he has witnessed. Dark room is a literal place to develop photos, but metaphorically represents the dark places in his mind. With spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. Spools of suffering is a powerful metaphor, as the film canisters contain images of pain. He is literally holding suffering in his hands. Ordered rows is sibilant, as the S sound creates a quiet, clinical atmosphere. It shows his attempt to bring order to the chaos of war. The only light is red and softly glows, as though this were a church and he. Red suggests blood, danger, and the nightmare heat, but also the sanctuary lamp in a Catholic church. Church is a simile that compares the dark room to a sacred space, as his work is not just a job, it is a solemn religious duty to remember the dead. A priest preparing to intone a mass. Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh, all flesh is grass. Priest shows he is a witness to death, performing a ritual for those who have no one else to mourn them. Belfast, Beirut are a list of war zones. The caesura, meaning the full stops in the line, mimic the clicking of a camera shutter, as we said before. All flesh is grass is a biblical allusion, and this is the reference here, and it means life is fragile and temporary, as humanity is easily mown down like grass. He has a job to do. Solutions slop in trays beneath his hands, which did not tremble then. He has a job to do as a short, functional sentence, and he is trying to remain professional and detached to avoid breaking down from what he can see in the photographs. Did not tremble then is irony, because in the heat of battle he was steady and brave, but now, in the safety of the home, the trauma is finally hitting him. Though seen to now. Rural England, home again, to ordinary pain which simple weather can dispel. Rural England has soft, gentle sounds contrasting with the harsh names of war zones before. Ordinary pain suggests that the problems of British people like bad weather are simple and trivial compared to the horrors of war that the sky has seen before. To fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in nightmare heat. Fields which don't explode is a direct reference to landmines, and running children is an allusion to the famous Napalm Girl photo from the Vietnam War, which emphasizes the vulnerability of innocent victims in the war. Something is happening. A stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes. Something is happening is a simple sentence that creates tension as the photo begins to develop. Twist is a violent verb as it describes the chemicals changing the paper, but also suggests the man's face was distorted in pain. A half-formed ghost. He remembers the cries of this man's wife, how he sought approval. Half-formed ghost suggests the man in the photo is dead, for his memory is haunting the photographer as it develops. Sought approval shows the moral dilemma of the photographer, as he had to ask permission with a look to take a photo of a dying man's final moments. Without words to do what someone must, and how the blood stained into foreign dust. Someone must. He believes his work is a moral necessity. If he doesn't take the photo, the world won't know about what happened during the war. And foreign dust shows how life is discarded and forgotten in other countries as the blood is just staying in the dirt. 100 agonies in black and white, from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6. 100 agonies is a metaphor for the photos, as the sheer scale of suffering is reduced to a small number of pictures. Pick out 5 or 6 shows the cold commercial reality of the media, as the editor cares about what sells, not the truth of the pain and suffering of the people going through the war. For Sunday's supplement, the reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the path and pre-lunch beers. Sunday's supplement, these horrors are consumed as casual entertainment on a day of rest. Prick with tears is a tiny shallow physical reaction as the readers are only moved for a second before returning to their beers. Bath to beers, that quote is internal rhyme as it has plosive B sounds, creating a mocking, bouncy rhythm that trivializes the public's sympathy for these poor individuals. From the aeroplane, he stares impassively at where he earns his living and they do not care. Impassively suggests he has become numb, as he no longer feels he belongs in England, but he is just a worker in the war zones. They do not care suggests the final biting critique, as they refers to the British public who consume his photos but do nothing to stop the wars. Let's have a look at doing a section by section analysis then. So lines 1 to 6 has the dark room ritual, and what happens here is the photographer is alone in his dark room, laying out film canisters in ordered rows under a red light, feeling like a priest performing a mass. The sibilance and order structure in this part show his attempt to impose control on the chaos he has witnessed, and the religious imagery suggests that his work is a sacred duty to the dead, transforming the dark room into a sanctuary. The main techniques in this section are sibilance in spools of suffering, religious metaphor in priest, mass, and church, and the biblical allusion, for example, all flesh is grass. Next section is lines 7 to 12, which is about the trembling hand. And what happens here is as he develops the photos, his hands begin to shake. He contrasts the ordinary pain of England with the nightmare heat of war zones where children are running through landmines. The trembling here reveals his delayed PTSD, as he was professional during the war, but the safety of home allows the trauma to surface. The contrast between the simple weather and exploding fields highlights the massive gap between his two worlds. Techniques here are contrast and juxtaposition in rural England versus Belfast, irony in the steady hands then versus trembling now, and the emotive imagery in running children. Lines 13 to 18 show the half-formed ghost. What happens is a specific image begins to develop, the face of a dying man. The photographer remembers the man's wife and the silent agreement he made to document the death. The man is a ghost because he is dead, but also because he haunts the photographer's conscience. The blood stained into foreign dust suggests that these lives are treated as disposable by the rest of the world. Main techniques are metaphor in half-formed ghost, sensory imagery in cries, twist, and the word choice, for example, must. Lines 19 to 24 shows the public indifference. What happens is the editor selects only a few photos for the newspaper. The readers feel a tiny bit of sympathy before continuing with their comfortable lives, and the photographer flees back to work. feeling alienated from both places. The effect is that the poem ends with a bitter critique of society. The eyeballs prick show how shallow the public's empathy is, and the photographer's impassive stare shows he has become desensitized and isolated, realizing that his efforts to make people care are failing. Techniques are the internal rhyme, for example, tears and beers, mocking tone, the cyclical structure as well, where they are returning to the war. So here is the overall interpretation of this poem. And it says, Carol and Duffy's war photographer explores the profound disconnect between the horrific reality of war and the safe, indifferent world of those who consume it as media. Through a rigid, ordered structure and disturbing religious imagery, the poem depicts the photographer as a lonely, priestly figure who bears the psychological burden of witnessing 100 agonies while society remains impassive. The poem suggests that war is an indelible stain on both the land and the mind, transforming memories into half-formed ghosts that haunt the observer. By the end, the photographer's realization the public do not care reveals a bleak truth, that the ordered rows of his photos cannot bridge the gap between rural England and the nightmare of conflict, leaving the witness in a state of permanent isolated trauma. Now, let's have a look at a comparison checklist for essays. So we have to make sure we mention these points in our essays. These include the detached observer. Unlike the soldiers in Remains or Bayonet Charge, the photographer is a witness, not a participant, yet he is still haunted. The order versus chaos, so the use of rigid standards and ordered roles to try and contain the nightmare of war. The critique of society, so the biting contrast between black and white agony and the triviality of pre-lunch beers, and the sacred duty, as the photographer, as priest, suggests that documenting suffering is a moral necessity, even if it is ignored. Let's have a look at comparing this poem. So we can compare this poem with Exposure. So similarities between Exposure and War Photographer and the psychological toll. Both poems explore the mental strain of war. While Owen's soldiers face ice east winds, Duffy's photographer faces the spools of suffering that twist in his mind. They also both have a similarity to do with the sense of isolation, as both the soldiers in the trenches and the photographers in his dark room are isolated from normal society, feeling abandoned by those who do not care. They also both look at the ordered chaos, because both poems contrast the chaotic reality of war with a sense of grim ritual. The soldiers wait in an ordered trench, while the photographer set out his film in ordered rows. Differences are the type of suffering. In Exposure, the suffering is physical and immediate, with the cold and the wind. In War Photographer, suffering is psychological and delayed, for example, the memories of the half-formed ghost. Another difference is the outcome. Exposure ends with physical death, such as all their eyes are ice, whereas War Photographer ends with a moral and emotional death, where the photographer becomes impassive to the world he tries to save. We can also compare it with Remains. So similarities between War Photographer and Remains are the haunting power of guilt. Both poems feature a ghost of a dead man that haunts the protagonist, for example, half-formed ghost versus blood shadow. They also both show the stain of war, as both use the metaphor of blood being permanent and difficult to clean, for example, blood stained into foreign dust versus his bloody life in my bloody hands. They also both show the failure of escape, as both men return home to England but find that they cannot leave the war behind. It follows them into their domestic lives. Differences are participant versus observer. The soldier in Remains is the one who pulled the trigger, leading to direct guilt, whereas the photographer in More Photographer is an observer whose trauma comes from his powerlessness to help. The difference again is the tone, as Remains written in an aural, colloquial, and frantic tone, whereas War Photographer is more detached, clinical, and somber, reflecting the photographer's attempt to remain professional. Let's have a look at key quotes to revise for War Photographer then. So we've got a few here. The first one is in his dark room he is finally alone, with spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. Sibilance and metaphor shown here, as it shows his attempt to bring order to the chaos and trauma he has witnessed. Then we have the Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh, all flesh is grass. This is a list and biblical allusion, as the short sentences mimic a camera shutter and remind the reader that life is fragile and easily destroyed. A stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes, a half-formed ghost. This is a metaphor describing the photo developing while suggesting the dead man's memory is haunting him. 100 agonies in black and white is a metaphor, as black and white suggests the photos are clear evidence of pain, but also that the public sees the conflict in oversimplified terms. The reader's eyeballs prick, with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. This has internal rhyme, shows the shallow momentary sympathy of the public before they return to their comfortable lives.